So tonight I'm pleased to introduce Jennifer L. Eberhardt to Politics and Prose. Eberhardt is a professor of psychology at Stanford University and the recipient of a 2014 MacArthur Genius Grant. She is the co-founder and co-director of SPARK, which is short for Social Psychological Answers to Real-World Questions, a Stanford center that brings together researchers and practitioners to address significant social problems. In her new book, Dr. Eberhardt explores one of the central controversies and culturally powerful issues of our time, unconscious bias. You don't have to be racist or sexist to be biased, and the uncomfortable truth about bias is that we are all affected by it, and we all practice it. However, as Dr. Eberhardt explains, we are not all hopelessly doomed by our innate prejudices, and her practical suggestions for reform are both useful for organizations and individuals. Because bias is a human problem, we all must contribute to its solution. Senator Kamala Harris writes, "This book helps us to scientifically view how racial bias works in our own minds and throughout society. We could not ask for a better guide to understand this reality than Jennifer Eberhardt. Her research reveals critical information that can help leaders better understand how biases can impact our judgment and how we are perceived by the communities we are sworn to serve." Now please join me in welcoming Dr. Eberhardt.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you all for coming. It's an honor to stand before you today to celebrate the publication of my first book, Biased. I like saying that. I've dedicated my career to understanding how racial and social inequality can, affect us. And I'm a social psychologist by training. Using a wide variety of methods and populations, I've conducted numerous studies documenting the power of race to dictate our perception and behavior, even as we remain blind to its operation and to the severity of its consequences. My research is driven not only by my curiosity about human behavior, but also by my desire to address significant social problems. And much of my current research on race focuses on policing and criminal justice more broadly. I have a long-standing interest in the ways that social perception shape visual perception, a relationship that appears in high relief in the context of criminal justice. So, for example, simply exposing people to black faces, I've found, can facilitate their detection of crime objects. Prompting people to think of violent crime can lead them to look toward black faces and away from white faces. Prompting police officers to think of shooting, arresting, and capturing leads their eyes to settle on black faces. In addition, officers judge blacks whose faces they perceive as more stereotypically black, as more criminal than those with less stereotypical features. And although looking black is not a crime, jurors are more likely to deliver a death sentence to black felons who are judged to have more stereotypically black features, at least when their victims are white. Just as the blackness of a defendant can increase people's desire to punish, so too might the blackness of the penal institution increase their acceptance of punitive criminal justice policies. Over the last several decades, punitive criminal justice policies have both dramatically increased the incarceration rate and exacerbated racial disparities in incarceration. As we know today, although African Americans make up about 12% of the U.S. population, they comprise nearly 40% of the prison population. In more recent studies, I found that when voters are prompted to believe the prison population is more black, they show more support for punitive crime policies than when prompted to believe that the prison population is less black. So, yes, I am a social psychologist. I am also a descendant of slaves and sharecroppers. My people are from Alabama and Georgia. They moved to Cleveland, Ohio in the 1920s and the 1940s to escape the terror of the Jim Crow South and to embrace the promise of the North to protect them. I was born in Cleveland, Ohio, in the year of the Voting Rights Act, in the wake of the Civil Rights Movement, in the first generation of those who would later be incarcerated in unprecedented numbers. I was born in an all-Black world. And when my parents decided we would move to an all-white suburb called Beechwood, when I was 12 years old, my life was changed. I had access to resources that I didn't know existed. I was in a place suddenly where everyone was expected to go to college, to do great things, to succeed. And I couldn't help but recognize the relationship between race and opportunity. And that move to Beechwood, it was just a bike ride away from my old neighborhood. That move raised all kinds of questions in my mind about race, questions that I never stopped exploring or probing or seeking the answers to. James Baldwin once wrote, "A journey is called that because you cannot know what you will do with what you find, or what you find will do to you." In this book, Biased, I take readers on a journey. I take them into neighborhoods and schools and workplaces and police departments. And at each stop along the way, I light up the way bias operates. I explain how it affects our vision and our choices and our actions, even when we are not aware of it. And I blend the science of bias with the stories of those who have been affected by it. Though we are often blind to bias, I light up the harms, the devastation that bias can leave in its wake. This book has been a hell of a journey for me. And there are so many people who have accompanied me in my journey in producing these pages. My book agent and his team at Idea Architects, the publishing team at Viking in New York, my writing coach and sister-in-law, Sandy Banks, my colleagues and research collaborators, my friends, my cousins, my siblings, my children, my partner, Rick Banks. I would also like to acknowledge my parents. They both died in their 50s. They did not meet my children. They are not here to celebrate this moment. Yet, while they were here on this earth, they moved, they worked, they fought until the bitter end. And here I stand, ready, honored to do the same. Thank you. So I've never actually been the subject of a book signing and all that before. So I'm not quite sure. I could read from the book, or I could I'm planning to take questions from the audience anyway, but I don't know, like, if people like the reading, or you feel like you can just read on your own. So, okay. Okay. I also like telling stories. I tell a lot of stories in the book. And I tell a lot of stories about just myself and growing up. I tell stories about my children. I tell stories about the people that I met along the way as I was writing these pages. I met so many people who just, inspired me and give me hope about these issues and about this country, actually. And I hope, as you read the book, that you're inspired by their stories as well. And, I start this book where I'm entering this kind of hostile place. I was actually in the police department in Oakland, California. I was brought in to be a subject matter expert to analyze data on stops and searches. And I was about to release a report on our findings. And I had the bright idea that before the findings were released, I wanted to offer this implicit bias training to the whole department. And so I had, because the department is, I guess, a moderate size. At the time, it was like about 550 officers. Now it's larger than it was. So I had about 11, of these sessions to do, and they were round the clock. Some of my friends know I don't do well at night, but police officers work through the night, right? So they were like, oh, okay, well, if you want to offer this tutorial, you're going to have to come, at 10 o'clock at night. I'm like, not 10, I'm in bed by then usually. And then there's a midnight shift and there's a 2 in the morning. I'm like, oh my. So anyway, so this was the book opens and I'm doing my very first implicit bias tutorial. And there are 132 officers who are in this auditorium. And I walk in, and as soon as I walk in, I could feel a chill, in the room. I mean, they were sitting there, and they were completely still and expressionless. They had on, full gear and all that, bulletproof vests and you name it, right? So they're sitting there waiting for me. I take the stage and I look out and I thought, whoa, I don't know if I'm going to be able to make it through this. And so I started, with my little thing. I have lots of PowerPoint slides going usually when I talk about this issue with a lot of images. I have demos that I do. But like nothing was working with them, and I was telling jokes, like nothing landed, like nobody said a word, right? And then I spotted this captain who I liked a lot. His name was LaRon Armstrong. And we had done lots of trainings together. So I knew he knew the importance of this message, right? So I looked at him and I was so relieved to see him out there in the audience until I saw his face and he was looking like, and he was squirming in his seat, and it was clear that he was a little worried about how things were about to go down, and so that made me even more worried. And so then I decided I was going to stop with the PowerPoint slides and stop with the jokes and the demos and everything, and just tell a story. So this is the story I told. It was story about one of my sons, Everett. We were on a plane together when he was just 5 years old. And we were on this plane and, he's 5, right? So he's wide-eyed and he's looking around. He's all excited, to be on a plane with mommy. And he's like checking everybody out. And he looks at this guy and he says, hey, that looks like Daddy. And I look at the guy, and he doesn't look anything at all like Daddy. I mean, like nothing. And I noticed, okay, he's a black guy, so I'm looking around too, right? And I noticed he was the only black guy on the plane. And I thought, all right, I'm going to have a little talk with my son about how not all black people look alike, right? So I'm getting ready to have this talk, thinking, okay, how do you do this with the 5-year-old, right? I'm getting all ready. But then I paused because I thought about the fact that children see things differently from adults. They haven't had years and years of conditioning, they haven't been socialized to only see things in a certain way, in certain categories. And I thought, well, maybe there is some resemblance there and I'm just missing it. So I look at the guy and I look at his height and there is no resemblance there, right? He's about 4 inches shorter than my husband. And I look at his weight, nothing there. I look at his facial features, just nothing there. Skin color, nothing there. I look at his hair and he has these long dreadlocks flowing down his back. And my husband's bald. So, all right, okay, you're going to get the talk. That's what I was thinking. So I'm all set to give him the talk. And then he looks up and he says, I hope he doesn't rob the plane. And I said, what? What did you say? He said it again. Well, I hope he doesn't rob the plane. And I said, well, Everett, you know Daddy wouldn't rob a plane. And he said, yeah, I know. And I said, well, why did you say that? And he looked at me with this really sad face. And he said, I don't know why I said that. I don't know why I was thinking that. We're living with such severe racial stratification that even a 5-year-old can tell us what's supposed to happen next. So I tell that story, right? And I look back out at the audience in this auditorium filled with police officers. And I'll read what happens next here. I took a deep breath. And when I looked back out at the crowd in the auditorium, I saw that their expressions had changed. Their eyes had softened. They were no longer uniformed police officers, and I was no longer a university researcher. We were parents, unable to protect our children from a world that is often bewildering and frightening. A world that influences them so profoundly and so insidiously and so unconsciously that they and we don't know why we think the way we do. So that's the opening of the book, and I kind of set the stage for this journey, right, that's about to begin. And I explain, what bias is, what does it look like in policing, and how does it show up in the criminal justice system more broadly, but also how does it show up in us, right? How does it show up in our neighborhoods, in our workplaces, in our schools? And so this is what the book is about, and it's not simply about documenting the problem in all of these different ways and its different guises, but it also points at solutions. So about half the book, starting in, I think, chapter 7, there are 10 chapters. Well, not quite half, like if you do the math. Almost half. I not only kind of lay out the problem, but I start to talk about the solutions. I start talking about sort of what are the kinds of things we can do to combat this, to protect ourselves from, acting on bias, and even when we're targets of bias, what do we do? How do we move through this together? And this is something that social psychologists actually know quite a bit about. When we think about bias, we don't think about it as a stable trait, like a personality trait that somebody has. We sort of think about it as a condition. Right? It's a condition that has to do with how our brains are wired and the social world that we're exposed to. We know from lots of research now, decades of research, that bias is most likely to be expressed in certain situations. Like some situations are going to trigger bias more than others. And so we need to understand that, right? And understand, how we can protect ourselves from bias by really having a real sense of what situations are going to bring it alive. And that understanding gives us great power. And so it's one of the reasons, even though the book deals with a lot of heavy stuff and deals with stories of people who've been affected by bias that are quite significant and heavy and troubling, overall, I feel like it's a hopeful book because it's hopeful both in the science because we know how to address this. We know how to manage it, so to speak. And it's also hopeful, I feel like, in terms of the stories. There's so many people out there who have been kind of dealing with this in their own spaces and in their own ways, and yet they manage to go on. They manage to rise. They manage to turn their lives over to this in a way that helps everyone. And so I want you to learn about them and learn about their stories, and with the hope that their stories and the science will give you hope as well. Okay. Should I read something else? Okay. Okay. Let's see. Let me, maybe I'll read a funny story, because just to lighten up the mood here. This is a story actually about driving in Jamaica. And give me a little time. It's going to be a couple pages before you actually know what the purpose of the story is, but I'm going to start reading here anyway. Okay. In Jamaica, they drive on the opposite side of the road, British style, with the steering wheel on what Americans would consider the passenger side. My husband had been driving on the right side of the road for 35 years. The scientist in me wondered if that long indoctrination had left its mark on the neural pathways of his brain. The mother in me just hoped our family would make it to our destination unscathed. We are American, I reminded Rick, my husband, as we picked up the car and settled into our unfamiliar spots. Everything around us seemed to be on the wrong side, including the street lights and signs. The boys got a kick. Our three boys, they're teenagers now. Our boys got a kick out of seeing their dad maneuvering the steering wheel from the opposite side of the car. I sat in the front next to him, determined to be the sentry who would ensure that we stayed safe on unfamiliar roads in this unorthodox arrangement. Right away, I could tell we were going to have problems. From my perch on the left side, where the driver should be, it took some time to shake the feeling that I was the one actually driving. I had to try hard to keep my arms from moving up to grab the steering wheel that was not there. I found my right foot pressing down to slow the car as we closed in on the traffic ahead. The first time I saw a car heading toward us from the opposite direction, I was ambushed by panic. Stay left, I warned. Yet even as I yelled out the correct advice, something inside me kept signaling that we should stay to the right. That mental tug of war set my heart to racing. We are headed for disaster, I thought, as yet another car zipped past us on what felt to me like the wrong side of the street. I knew in my mind where we were supposed to be, but my body was feeling something else. Everything inside me was spontaneously firing, signaling, "This is wrong, you're in danger, get over to the right." By the time we made it to the center of town, rush hour was upon us. I don't like being in rush hour traffic in California, let alone in a foreign country on the wrong side of the road. But I needed to stay calm as we navigated avenues crowded with cars, bikes, motorcycles, and people standing in the middle of the street peddling their wares. We finally made it to a long stretch of highway that headed toward the countryside. We relaxed enough to enjoy the scenic vistas we passed, and even made a brief stop at a local tourist spot. It wasn't until we headed back to town that our driver's mental gymnastics faltered. As Rick began to merge onto the highway, the boys began screaming in the back seat. I skipped a line there. I turned my head to see what was wrong and got the scare of my life. Two giant 18-wheelers were speeding straight toward us, barreling down the highway, side by side at breakneck speed. But Rick had not noticed them because he was looking the other way, in the direction that traffic would be approaching if he was merging onto a road in California. I joined the yelling, but Rick was focused on the task at hand, steadily creeping onto the highway into the path of the trucks, still looking the other way, not comprehending what all our fuss was about. The truck drivers never slowed, presuming we would stop. Who wouldn't stop? In a fury, I yelled out as loud as I could, "Stop, stop, 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 stop the car right now." The panic in my voice led my husband to slam on the brakes, and we all watched as the truck sped past just inches away from the front of our car. I was sweating profusely, and my heart was pounding hard. We sat for a long few minutes in stunned silence. A lifetime of driving on the right side of the road in the United States had shaped my husband and me more than we realized. It shaped not only how we situated our vehicle on the road, but also where we were inclined to look, how and when we turned our heads, and what captured our attention. It shaped a cascade of reflexive choices that every driver makes. There was a complex, coordinated system within us operating beneath our awareness and difficult to override. A whole host of actions are required to support the act of driving, but we had become oblivious to them over decades behind the wheel. We operated on instinct, though it was wholly learned. I'd gotten into that car that day expecting to provide an extra set of eyes that could help protect our boys. Yet it was precisely because our sons had no driving experience that they could see the trucks that Rick and I had missed. They had not been conditioned to look only in certain ways or to expect to see specific things. In many ways, this is how bias operates. It conditions how we look at the world and the people within it, despite our conscious motivations and desires, and even when such conditioning can put us in harm's way. Just as drivers are conditioned by how the roads are constructed in their native land, so too are we conditioned by racial narratives that narrow our vision and bias how we see the people around us. Okay, that's it. Okay, thanks. Okay, is that enough? Okay. Okay, I think I will take questions now. And maybe the questions might inspire me to go back to the book and read it a little bit more if you desire. So I think you're supposed to go to the mic if you have, oh, there's a mic there. Okay, I'm nervous because this is my cousin is going to give me trouble.
Hey, Jennifer, I just had one question. Remember the texts I would send you from the Metropolitan Police Department and how they would outline about you can get I guess connected to the MPD to get information about what's happening in your neighborhood.
Yeah.
And so I just wondered, what did you think about those, and how do those impact our bias or reinforce things? Because they do go through and talk about, black male, Hispanic male, white male.
Right.
They give you.
And you're bombarded with this all the time, over and over.
Right.
Yeah. So it's funny. I really like those text messages. But my writing coach, your cousin, she gave the thumbs down. So they didn't make it into the book. But something else made it into the book, which is really similar, which is the fact that police officers are exposed to this kind of information too, right? And so they're hearing it over their police radio and, through the dispatch, right? So, like in Oakland, for example, they hear male Black. So they get the gender race pairing for everybody, for every suspect. This is just kind of how they are used to describing people. And so, Oakland is a pretty diverse city. And there used to be high crime in Oakland, but the crime level has decreased pretty substantially now. And so officers who worked in Oakland often heard male Black over the police radio. And, I was talking to one of the captains there, and he actually sat and listened and counted the number of times he heard male Black. And I think he just did this for, I think it was an hour or two, and he said he heard it, I believe, 61 times. Male Black, just in that short time frame. And officers are working 10-hour shifts. They're working at least 40 hours a day. And so if you look at how many times, this is like tens of thousands of times you're hearing male Black connected with crime over the course of a year. And so that's priming us, right? It's conditioning our brain to associate the two. And that conditioning can have a huge impact. It can have a huge effect on who we see as suspicious and sort of what actions we take and so forth. I have done these sort of tutorials, if you will, on implicit bias for a number of years now in different police departments. And once I met a man who was from Germany. And actually, this is a story that I do tell in the book. He's from Germany, and he came up to me after my talk about bias, and he said that he had been, I think, in the department for about 2 years at that point, and he said that doing the police work really changed him, and that he saw himself as a person who was egalitarian, and he wanted to treat everybody as an individual. And these were values that were really important to him. But he saw this change happening in his mind over time, being exposed to the police work and the male Black pairing. And after a while, he just began to see all like Black men as suspicious. And so his eyes would linger longer if he saw a Black person, and he would look for their hands, and he would go in his mind through all these, sort of what would happen if the person did, X or Y, and he was kind of prepared, right, for battle. And his friends noticed this, who were not police officers, and they're like, hey, what's going on with you? Why are you looking at, Black men in this way? They noticed the difference. So the friends called him on it, basically, and he had to confront that in himself. And, he's just, asking me, sort of, his mind is changing in ways that are outside his control, and it happened pretty quickly. It's as though this, I don't know, the American scene was making its way into his brain and affecting how he saw the world, and also affecting his fear. He was. And his vigilance, he was in this sort of heightened state of arousal all the time, in the presence of Black people. And that's, I don't know. So this is what I mean when I say bias is both a product of our, wiring of our brain, and then also the social context, the social world that we're in, and those combined in a way that can sort of prompt us to experience bias and to act on that bias. So thank you. I promise I'll try to get shorter with my answers. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I always have to say before I start that I'm not from the United States. I'm from the Caribbean. So I was happy to hear that you read something from not that part of the Caribbean.
Okay, where are you from?
But St. Martin, Aruba, St. Martin. But I consider myself to be of all the Caribbean, from Cuba to
I had to tell you something. I really wanted to go to St. Martin before this book tour, but my publicist said that was not a good idea. So I'm hoping to get there sometime. I hear it's beautiful.
Well, I hope you get it, because within 30 to 40 years, our islands is going to be destroyed with the rising sea waters. But be that as it may,
Wow.
I grew up in the Netherlands, and I'm a little bit afraid because I agree fundamentally with everything you've said up to this point in time, right, as a social psychologist. But to believe that somehow one can deal with bias, prejudice, racism, discrimination in a social psychological way.
Okay.
Right? Without massive redistribution of wealth, income, power, without massive doing something about economic conditions that lead to all of these problems, right?
Right.
Would tremendously worry me. So having said that, I would like to ask you, you said you were somewhat optimistic about where the world going, where the Western world is going now. I must tell you, I'm quite pessimistic.
Yeah.
I'm very pessimistic. I said it I remember in the law school in Utrecht, before I left, I was asked to give a talk.
Yeah.
And I said in this talk, I said, guys here, listen to me. You all look at me straight. Okay, I know I'm a pain in the ass Caribbean person, but look at me. And I'm going to tell you straight to your face, okay? As somebody partly of European descent, but of African descent and Caribbean descent, right? If you guys are unwilling to directly confront racism in this society, this is before all of the problem now we have in the Netherlands with basically a quasi-fascist party. If you had told people in the 1980s when I was there that a quasi-fascist party was going to be 20 to 30%, they would literally have locked you up. They say thinking too much. You've literally lost it. I mean, we are beyond that.
Right.
We are tolerant, enlightened type of people.
Right.
If you do not want, and if the white world is not willing, and at this point in time, one has to say, there's more and more signs that they're fundamentally unwilling to do this, to confront racism and obviously prejudice and bias in a direct, ongoing way, round the clock, 24 hours a day, right? In schools, education institutions, museums, media, everywhere.
Right.
That if you do not do that, then this social psychological dealing with it, I think is an easy way out and no way out at all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate the comments. So let me just say that when I say that there are conditions under which social psychologists know that bias is less likely to be activated and conditions under which it's more activated. That's not to say that the disparities that we see in the world don't matter. It's not a either or, it's a both and those disparities actually have real impact on our thinking and on our psyches. And I think you need to look at both. I think you can't just look at, fixing things through policies, although I feel like that's hugely important to change policy and practice. But because it seeps up again, because if you don't attack the narratives that drive those policies, you just have other policies and you have other avenues and other ways in which that bias reasserts itself. And so we need both. We need both an attention to structure, we need attention to policy, attention to practice, but we also need some attention to how our minds work and sort of why we have the narratives that we do, especially the racial narratives that we do about people of color in this country, and that work has to happen too. And the book really is not just about sort of our minds in isolation. It's our minds feeding off of all the inequality that's out there in the world, and what happens to us as we do this. What happens to our children as they're exposed to this. So thank you for the question.
Hi, good evening. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Julie Williams, and I work with a nonprofit here in DC and do a lot of work I'm in education, do a lot of work looking at bias and its influence in the educational setting. Right. And you mentioned earlier that your book is hopeful and that it offers suggestions. And I'm curious if you could touch upon some of the suggestions that you offer that may be applied in an education setting, especially for a teacher.
Okay, good. Thank you. So yeah, I have a couple chapters actually in the book, one on K through 12 education and one on higher ed. And actually there is research in the education world that it's a little more hopeful than some of the the other spaces. There are lots of studies looking at ways to intervene, especially around achievement differences, but also looking at differences in school discipline, for example. So I've done some studies where we looked at how teachers respond to sort of minor infractions from children. And we did these studies. We took practicing teachers and we had them imagine teaching in a school, and they read an office referral record, that was produced for a student who misbehaved in some benign way by, say, getting tissues from a tissue box and, disrupting the class in this way. And we, asked those teachers, how big of an infraction is this? How would you, address this? To what extent do you feel like this child should be disciplined? But we changed the race of the student. So either the student for half of the participants was Black, for the other half the student was white. And initially, we found no differences there in how teachers said they thought about the misbehavior, nor in terms of how they would discipline the student. But then we said to these teachers, okay, the child is 3 days later and the same child is misbehaving again. And they are now, I think, sleeping in class and refusing to do work. So kind of, fairly, relatively mild things. And we found that's where we saw the bias come online. So we saw that, Black Darnell, when he misbehaved, the misbehavior was seen as much more severe and problematic and disruptive than white Greg, even though, it was exactly the same description of the misbehavior, right? And they were significantly more likely to punish Black Darnell than white Greg. We also asked them sort of, how do you think this child would fare down the road? They were said that they sort of imagine Black Darnell being suspended down the road. They also, when we looked at why race seemed to be producing this difference in response, we found that for white Greg, when they learned about that student, they saw the two misbehaviors as isolated. One had nothing to do with the other. And so it wasn't like a cumulative sort of issue. But for Black Darnell, they saw the two misbehaviors as connected. They saw a pattern there. And that led them to think about Black Darnell as more of a troublemaker. And so that led them to imagine, a student who is not a good student and that needed to be sort of punished and brought into line and so forth. We also, there's another study that I wasn't a part of, but one of my former students did this study. He also did the study with me that I just talked about, but he was looking at interventions, because you asked about interventions. And so he was really sort of interested in how teachers how do teachers discipline students, and what messages do they send about that discipline? And so he, designed a study where he actually went into schools. I think it was 5 different schools in Northern California area, and trained teachers on this sort of what he calls empathetic discipline. And so when you discipline a child, you're just telling them why it is that you're disciplining disciplining them, and you're disciplining not for punishment, but because you believe in that child and you want to see them grow and develop. You feel connected to that child, and you're trying to sort of get them on the right track. They asked teachers, as they discipline or as they thought about disciplining a child, to sort of think about, sort of how to do this in an empathetic way, and to think about the child, as a student, not as a problem. And just doing this, I mean, this is fairly sort of a simple kind of intervention. And they did this only with the math teacher. So this was in junior high schools, and so the intervention was just with the math teachers, and they found that they were able, with this intervention, cut the discipline rate, the actual discipline rate in those schools, in half. By changing the perspective on how they discipline, it also changed the perspective of the child on why they were disciplined, and so it didn't move them away from the school. It actually sort of brought them closer to the school and closer to the teacher. They felt like for the children who had just one teacher, right, the math teacher who went through this intervention, they felt that the teachers in the school more generally were more fair, that they looked out for children, the children in the school and so forth. And so that, affected, their own. So not only did they reduce the discipline rate, they also reduced children's, sort of concern and worry about the teachers in the school, and increased their trust in the teachers in the school. So that's one example. There are many examples in other contexts too, but I'll keep moving, and hopefully some of those will come up in the questions. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for coming. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to take the liberty of sort of interpreting somewhat and divide what you've said into two pieces. Okay. You have told us mostly about how people behave when they receive information, and the stories you've given us are, demonstrate that people who've received information behave in ways they don't recognize as having originated outside themselves. The other piece, which I'd like for you to elaborate on more, is, for lack of another term, what I have called signaling. Okay. That is that there's a whole process in which people are living sort of in a soup of information coming at them all the time. Yeah. And there are authority figures and opinion leaders and various people who have the power to influence them. But as receivers of this information, they are not conscious that they're. So it's the same phenomenon, but I'm pointing to the other side of it. I'll give you one example that I encountered in the early 1980s. Reagan was elected and appointed Ann Gorsuch to be head of the EPA, and in the first 2 years, really, they were looking at changing the regulations about auto emissions, but they didn't change anything. So the law stayed the same, and the regulatory agency was still there, and the public was still in the same position they had. The technology didn't change. Yeah. But somehow in that situation, without the administration telling people to do so, thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people cut off their catalytic converters, and it left the permanent impact that more leaded gasoline was used. And there weren't any specific directions to do that. Right. But somehow, when people who were the same people as they were before 1981, they behaved differently just because they saw the atmosphere, the authority around them change, and it made them behave differently. Yeah. So I've always wondered if anybody has sort of developed a discipline of measuring and defining how that signaling system works. And it's implied in what you're saying, but I'd like to see you elaborate more on that.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think, one way to answer that is to sort of think about this in terms of social norms that our, leaders, have, extraordinary power in setting what those norms are. And so even when we don't believe, say, in the norms that are being set, we are now sort of situated in a space where that is, that's what's expected, and that's how people interact, and that's what we see. And so our behavior starts to slip towards this thing to be more in line with the norms that are in the situation, even when we personally say don't wish it to be. And so that could be, sometimes it could be a good thing, maybe, if you're trying to, if the leaders are trying to bring about good behavior and something that is actually, productive and healthy and useful. But then it has the same power for bad. I mean, it has the same power, when if we wanted to steer away from things, even personally, if we wanted to, behave a certain way, we're kind of, we're pulled to go this other way because our environment has shifted in that way. And there's all these signals coming out of the environment, like you say, that kind of help us to act like that. And we see that, our children see that too. I can tell you another quick story about a different son now. This is when this son was in first grade, and he was asking me one day, this was at Thanksgiving time, and I'm in the kitchen and I'm cooking, and he says, Mommy, do you think people see black people a little differently from white people? And he's a first grader, right? And I said, well, why do you ask that? And he says, I don't know. I just feel like there's something different. And so this is like this, he's like picking up on something. There's some signaling, as you would put it. And I said, well, you have to give me an example. I'm not sure what you mean. And he sat there and he was thinking, and then he came up with an example, which he said, how we were at Safeway the other day. I said, yeah, I remember. And he said, we live in a mostly white neighborhood, right? So he said, there was a black guy that came into the Safeway, and he says, and I noticed that people kind of stood away from him a little bit, right? And then he was in this Star Wars phase then, and so he said it was like he had a giant force field around him when he was walking through the store. And he said, yeah, and then when he stood in line, his line ended up being the shortest line, and then I said, well, what do you think that means? He said, I don't know. He said, but there's something different. And he just sat there, and I said, well, think about it. And he sat there, he was thinking about it. And just as I was putting the turkey in the oven, he looked up and he said, I think it's fear. Yeah. And I was so startled, I burned my hand on the oven rack, and that burn stayed on my hand for about a year. And every time I looked at that burn, I thought about that conversation we had. And it's like, so you talk about signaling. I mean, I think people like to think, we get this from television, or we get this from the movies and all that. But our children get it from us, right? And just how we move through the world, and what that signals about who these people are, and what their standing is, and what they're like, and all of that. Like our children, we don't have to say, this group is like this other group is like this. Here's a stereotype you need to know about these people. You don't have to say any of that. You signal that with your body language and the fear that they can see on you. So thank you.
I have a quick comment and a question. My comment is, I'm so grateful that you wrote this book and that we need it now more than ever. And so thank you for that. My question goes to your presentation with the police department. Well, the other part of my comment is that your storytelling is very powerful. And when you told the story of your son on the plane, I think we kind of got it. And that was such a good way of teaching that obviously. So in terms of doing that kind of a program with police, obviously implicit bias can be deadly. Yeah. In certain occupations. Yes. And so with police, with Black Lives. So can you bring me up to date on where that stands in police training, and how did those police officers respond to your training that day?
Well, I had them for a moment when I told that story, but then they went back. They froze up again. But over time, I think there has been a shift. I've seen a shift there. It took years rather than minutes. So now that they're seeing changes in the department, it's providing a space for them to talk about bias that they didn't have before. I think before they felt pretty defensive, about it, and now they're willing to have the conversation because they see their role in it more. And so I can give you an example. So, when we produced this report, we showed that there were huge racial disparities in who the officers stopped and who they searched and who they handcuffed even. And they felt like they were upset about this because they felt like just pointing out the disparity was saying that they were racist, that they were profiling, that they were biased, but they weren't biased. So when we sort of asked, what did you want to see? They said, well, we wanted to see more information in the report about why we stop people. And so oftentimes we stop people because it's an intelligence-led stop. So this is a stop where we have credible information, very specific information that ties a person to a specific crime. And so we're getting this intelligence. And so we're not stopping people willy-nilly. And that's how the report kind of reads, but we were stopping them because of this intelligence. But the problem was they weren't tracking those kinds of stops. They weren't tracking, this intelligence leading to the stop. So we had no way of actually analyzing that. And so I, said to them, well, we can't analyze data that we don't have. And so we sat down together like a focus group team of people, and we worked on actually trying to figure out a way to track whether a stop was intel-led or not. And we came up with a really simple system. So when they stop someone on the street, they have to complete a form saying sort of why they stopped the person, the location of the stop, the race of the person, all of that, right? So we added one question that had a check mark there. So it was this stop intelligence-led? Yes or no, right? So they, if they checked yes, they had to say the source of the intelligence. Was it a daily bulletin or a weekly report? That kind of thing. And then they had to describe the context that made it an intel-led stop. And we found, so in 2017, when they didn't have that and they were sort of doing things the normal way, they made about 32,000 stops in Oakland. And in 2018, after the introduction of this intel-led checkbox, the stops went from 32,000 to 19,000. So they went way down. And the thing is, it's like, so part of it, we just wanted to track it to see like what percentage of the stops are intelligence-led, because they were telling us, 90%, 95%. We found it was closer to like 30% or 35%. So that was information for them. But the other thing is just having that checkbox produce a change in their state of mind, right? Because now they had to think, is this stop intel-led? Like every time they're stopping someone, this is on their minds because they have to, this is a mandatory question that they have to answer. And then they might think, well, looking back at all my other stops, how many of those stops were intel-led? And then that leads them to think, do I need to make this stop? Like, is this a high priority stop? Is this in line? I mean, all of the stops are legal, but we're talking about, beyond that, like, is this a good stop? Like, is it a stop that, that the kind of stop that you would want to make. And so sometimes, that question was no. And so they weren't just sort of using their intuition about who looks suspicious and all of that, and then using, legitimate reasons to stop the pretextual reasons, like the license plate light is out and that kind of thing, which that's still a legal stop. But oftentimes they would do that to just kind of check the person out. And so what they ended up doing, they deprioritized those kinds of equipment, stops, and then they prioritized the intel-led stops. And with that direction so this is an example of how policy and practice and getting direction from leaders can actually influence what you do and make a real difference on the ground. So that's an example of that. Thanks.
So did
Oh, we're out of time already?
No, I just want
almost. Okay, all right. Okay, all right. I'm having fun up here. Hi.
Okay. So thank you so much, by the way. It's really fascinating information. My mom's in school psych, so especially the education information pieces, she's always spewing articles and stuff, so it's like hand in hand. But I'm actually really curious on like another topic, which I'm not sure if you're familiar with Wesley Morris's commentary on the Oscar Best Picture kind of thing.
Okay.
Quick sum up is that there, with this year's or this past Oscars, Best Picture was contrasted with Driving Miss Daisy, which he said that was really fascinating in that it's kind of a juxtaposition outside of already poor research and everything that happened with the Best Picture. But there's a juxtaposition of a lead character. So in Driving Miss Daisy, we have Morris Freeman, and Morgan Freeman, and we have, it's this older white lady who is really kind of racist, and she's kind of portrayed against more racist people, so that way it's like, okay, she's not like as bad as them. But it's kind of like, and this is a paraphrase quote, but his quote was the best. He was like, it's as if this Black person had to, with this white lady who had this enormous journey that she had to go on, went with this Black person who had no journey to go on to come to this conclusion of reducing that prejudice. And then finally you end up at the end of the movie where it's like, oh, she's like not so bad anymore. She's like palatable. And so it kind of was like a juxtaposition. And the broader conversation was the topic of, if I just have a best friend that is Black, or, I have some Asian friends, like, that makes me okay. It's kind of this identification of that does not provide restitution for your racial actions.
Right.
And that also does not change the implicit bias.
Right.
Because it's just proximity.
Right.
That's not delving in. Now, this does not discount, of course, authentic friendships between people of diverse backgrounds, gender, or race.
Right.
But I'm just curious to hear on like what your thoughts are for the implicit bias with conversations like that, because I feel like it's been something that's kind of been bubbling back up that, well, I don't really feel like I'm racist because I have like X insert person here who is my friend and I hang out with them like once a month and they tell me their life story. And so I should be fine. But
Right. Yeah. Thank you for that question. I mean, I think a lot of that has to do with how people define bias. I think people think about bias as so if you're saying I'm biased, you're saying I'm a bad person. And I think when that's the definition of bias, where you're calling into question their moral character and so forth, then they're going to want to defend that. And nobody wants to see themselves as a bad actor. My book agent wrote a book with Desmond Tutu and the Dalai Lama. And I can't remember which one of them said this, but I never forgot. He told me this. He said, whichever person it was, said that nobody's a villain in their own story. And I feel like that's so true. I see evidence of that, every day, all the time. And no matter, what you're doing and how horrific it is or bad it is, or, you find a way to, to write a narrative where you're the good person, or you're the savior, or, you're the, and people will protect that to the end, to their death, right? And so I think part of what you're seeing there with the, the best friend and all of that is that I want you to see me as a good person. But I think when you start to sort of think about how this could happen, this bias, despite your motivations or your intentions or your desires, then you could get to another, level of conversation because, it's about something deeper than that. It's a reflection too, like the gentleman there said, of the society that you are absorbing, the society we're living in, and you're kind of playing that out. And so people, it's hard for them to sit with that and to talk about that if they feel like they're the villain. So, all right, thanks.
Yeah. This is our final.
Okay, thanks.
Final question. 2 questions. 1, as a parent, what do you tell your son Everett when an Asian American jogger moves out of his path? And question 2, since you cite in your book empirical evidence that preschoolers detect race very early.
Yeah.
What do you tell people in Palo Alto, California, or sitting in Washington, D.C. at this bookstore they should do for their preschoolers to make them overcome this? Because I think this is the fundamental challenge of our society.
Yeah.
Even minority groups discriminate against another minority.
Yeah.
2 questions. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate it. Well, I can tell you what people often do, parents. They feel like they want to teach their children to be good people, and to do that is to be colorblind. I think that happens a lot, that you should ignore color, that if you ignore it, it's not there and you can't be affected by it, and so you can't be biased. So that's the idea. They teach this. I don't know where the young woman went who was a teacher, but they teach that in schools, all the time. That this is we're colorblind, right? We don't see color, but the research suggests otherwise. Well, first of all, it's hard not to see color. Because everything is tied to it from birth to death, and so it's hard not to see it. And then second of all, when you're teaching children not to see color, they don't see discrimination. And so that's a problem, right? Because so you're teaching your children this to protect them, but then that protection actually goes in the other way. It doesn't further racial equality, say. It actually does the opposite, because now you can't even acknowledge the discrimination that's there. You can't acknowledge the inequality that's out there. There's a colleague of mine did a fascinating study with elementary school kids looking at this, where they were taught in school to say, okay, we all want to be good people. We all believe in racial equality. Therefore, you should be colorblind. Or they had a second set of students who were taught, okay, we all want to be good people. We all want racial equality. So therefore, we should learn to value our differences. So 2 really different messages. And what they did was that they then showed them a situation where I think there are 2 kids playing soccer, one white, one black. The white boy knocks the black kid down, I think kicks him or something. And then somebody says, well, why did you do that? And the kid says, oh, because he's black. And I think he's going to play rough. And so I just kicked him and knocked him down. Right. So now the kids, when you ask them, is this bias, really different answers. So the kids who were in this condition of the study where they were told to value difference, they saw it as discriminatory. About 80% of them said, yeah, this is bad. This is discrimination. But if they were told to be colorblind, I think it was only about 50% of them actually saw a blatant racial incident as discriminatory. And then they were asked to describe what happened, and the researchers recorded it and played it back for the teachers. And so when the teachers heard the recordings, the kids who were in the colorblind condition, they described the situation in such a way that the teachers were less inclined to get involved. They didn't see it as much of a problem, and so they weren't going to get involved, right? So this is the point, right? So exactly. So the colorblind thing is not, people think that's what could be, this is what Martin Luther King, all of this you hear, but it's not, yeah, but it's not the panacea that people think it is. And so that's a big one. So what you, So that's what I'm getting to next. I'm getting
what did you say to Everett when he said, the Asian jogger moved out of the way?
I talked to Everett to not say, well, just ignore that, and oh, you shouldn't look at color, it doesn't matter, which is often what parents do. And I sat with him and asked him about it. I asked him how he came to the conclusion that, so he's talking about, well, I don't know if I should describe it because it would ruin the book. Okay. So, but I can even go back to the airplane story that I just told that's at the beginning of the book. Let's use that one. I didn't say, well, you shouldn't look at color. You know, that's wrong to look at color. I asked him why he thought that, and I forced him to actually reflect on it. And I just feel like there's a lot of power in the reflection on this. And so don't try to solve it by not talking about it or just pretending like it's not there. You need to confront it, and we need to confront it with our children too. You do them no service. You're not protecting them. You're not protecting us by refusing to have those discussions. And you would be surprised what children can handle. I mean, he thought about it. He was the one who, was saying, I don't know how that got into my mind, and so now when he thinks that again, he's going to think, why is that in my mind, right? So he's going to be sort of checking himself to an extent, and I feel like that's the power that we as parents need to provide for our children, so that they can sort of be on this journey, helping to to us to resolve all of this rather than hide from it. So I guess I should. Thanks. Thank you.